Hi guys! This week I thought I'd do a new medieval figure for you because it's been quite a while, and if you're a history buff you know that this is the 600th anniversary year for the Battle of Agincourt, which is of course a pretty famous big deal. I think there's going to be a reenactment next month, and they're doing a lot of other related events throughout the season. Karwansaray Publishers, you know, who I work for, have also been busy with that whole era. Our last issue of War Games and Soldiers and Strategy was focused around the Battle of Agincourt and, you know, the sort of action in the rest of Europe at that time. And Medieval Warfare magazine is going to be bringing out a special just on Agincourt next month as well. So if you're interested in either of those things, I will link to them below in the description box. So in order to properly pay honor to Agincourt, I need to find a knight figure from the right period, and this is what I came up with. This is by Claymore Castings. They do some really nice work from the medieval era. I think this sculpt is by Paul Hicks, not completely sure, but it's a really fine, delicately sculpted knight in sort of full plate armor. I believe he was even on the cover of the last War Games Soldiers and Strategy, but of course this will be my version. Now you can see there's no really skin exposed here, it's just all armor from head to foot. And if you've followed my channel for a while, you know that I actually did a fully armored knight before, but it's been a really long time, and I think that was actually one of my very first videos, really in the beginning. So the quality wasn't all that good, and I think I've actually gotten quite a bit better at painting, and I've also gotten better paint since then. At that time I was working with pretty substandard metallics, and now, as you know maybe from watching my videos, I use these Vallejo air paints, which are really nice. They flow beautifully. They make painting big metallic areas like this a lot easier. So I think, you know, it's worth showing this whole process again for people who are interested. And I think it should actually be a pretty easy figure to do. It should go pretty quickly. It's just mostly going to be metal with some details, and there's going to be probably a colorful surcoat, though it's not, you don't see too much of that, so there'll be limited space to get really creative with designs or heraldry or anything like that, but I'm going to try to make something that contrasts nicely with all of the metal. And actually, I should actually say, if you're wanting a nice looking army that's not going to be too hard to paint to a high standard, you know, and you can do it in a relatively quick amount of time, a medieval army actually might be something for you to consider, especially now that the Perrys have brought out all your really nice kind of medieval plastic box sets. That makes doing it also really cheap and gives you lots of custom options for, you know, adding character and personality into your army. So anyway, I'm going to just go ahead and get started on this Agincourt era medieval knight. Now, you know, normally I try to save painting metallic colors on my figures to the very last minute, but in this case, because the metallic area of the figure is sort of the dominant one, I'm going to start with it first. So I'm going to be base coating basically all the steel, metal areas here using a mixture of German gray and Vallejo air gunmetal. Obviously you can see there's a substantially higher proportion of the German gray in this mix to the gunmetal, and you're going to want to apply it generously, so don't worry too much at this point if you get it on places that we want to be other colors. That's okay, we'll paint over them later. The next step is to apply a generous wash of Nuln oil, and again, don't worry too much about being sloppy here. Just make sure you get it down in all of the cracks and crevices and sort of shaded areas on this figure. Now my first highlight on this figure is going to use this sort of similar colors to my base coat, but in different proportions. So you can see it's still pretty dark, but there's a lot more of the gunmetal in here now than the German gray. And I mean, partially it's just showing up better because that black wash darkened everything further, but you just want to have more gunmetal in your mix when you're putting on this coat. At this point, we're not going to worry too much about blending or highlighting. What we want to do here is just pick out all the individual segments of armor. If you remember, or you saw my last week's tutorial where I painted a Space Marine, an ultramarine, it's basically the same principle. We're trying to define all of the plates and separate pieces in the armor, and make sure we leave that dark base color down in all of the recesses and all the divides between the separate armor segments. So what you're really doing here is a lot of just careful brush work, picking out the separate pieces and trying to be neat about it. As for the chainmail, the best way to paint that here is just with some light overbrushing. So I suggest what you do is you paint sort of a normal segment of the armor, and then when you haven't got too much paint left on your brush, because wet, runny, thin paint is going to go down the cracks, which you don't want, so you want a relatively dry brush. Then you want to just sort of lightly go over the surface of the chainmail areas, which will make sure that you get the upper surfaces painted and easily leave all those sort of recesses down among the rings in the nice dark shade color that we're going to be wanting there. My next highlight is going to be just pure Vallejo air gunmetal, and I'm just going to start going back all over all of the areas that I already picked out before, but now we don't have to be so precise or worry so much about just really sort of blocking out the segments. At this point, we're going to start wanting to emphasize areas where light is hitting, as we do when we're working with any other color. So you can see that I'm focusing on his calves, the tops of his feet, the plates on his knees and thighs, his fingers, his elbows, just kind of from the top down where light can be hitting. Because we're working with a reflective paint here, it can be a little bit hard to see that you've made a difference. So you probably are going to have to tilt and move the figure around constantly to see what effect you're having. It will get shinier, but it's sometimes hard to see just how it's getting shinier. And again, we're repeating this sort of overbrushing process here on the chainmail, just building it up, but we're going to be focusing more on the middle segments of the chainmail, so it looks like it's sort of shining towards the middle and a little bit darker in the shadows. We're relying really here again on our black dark base coat, which is going to make it easier for us to build up more shades and tones more easily, by keeping the paint thin too. It's a little bit more transparent, so we can build it up and we can get some more gradually sort of shiny areas and just more depth on this figure as we work up along the different parts of the armor. Now, the next highlight layer I'm applying is a mixture of the gunmetal and Vallejo air steel, which is quite a bright, shiny color. And I'm just following the same procedure as before, now really focusing on areas where light is hitting, where I want it to be accentuated, and I'm blending the color out from those points. So I'm putting the paint in the shiniest areas and then sort of feathering and smoothing it out into the darker areas so that you can really see that some elements of the armor are shinier. Certainly, you're going to also want to always focus on edges of the armor where there's a divide in the plates or along the top edge of any piece where it sort of breaks off. You're going to really want to emphasize that with the brighter, shinier colors you're working on. Of course, the helmet should go without saying, really needs to be bright on top. And the sword blade too. Obviously, you're going to want, the sword blade has sides, so you're really going to want to make sure that you emphasize sort of the front, particularly of the sword, with brighter metal colors. The back can be darker metal colors, and probably one side you also want to keep brighter than the other. But I'm just working over it with this sort of lighter mix and slowly building up the color as I did in the last step. Now, it seems fast, but I've already got to the very last highlight in the armor, which is just pure Vallejo air steel. And here I'm just continuing to emphasize and brighten areas. By this point, you should really only be applying it to the extremist areas where you want the most bright light, sort of shiny, brilliant effect, where the most light's going to be hitting the armor, what you really want to accentuate. I'm not using this brightest color on the chainmail. The chainmail needs to appear purposely a little bit darker. It just should have a different tone, so you should not highlight it as far or as brightly as the rest of the armor. Try to, you want to keep that a little bit more subtle. But everywhere else, you're going to just have to use your discretion. You can see I'm really polishing that top of the helmet and really putting a lot of attention on the elbows, knees, the tops of the arms, the hands, and as I said before, one facet of the sword where I expect a lot of light to be hitting. I'm really making extra bright and shiny. Now, to further emphasize the chainmail and just help differentiate it a little bit better from everything else, I'm first going to give it a light color wash of Leviathan purple. That just gives it a slightly different tone, but to keep it from looking too purple, I'm then going to go back over it while it's still wet with Nuln Oil, which will darken it down. It'll have a slight tone, but it'll still be dark, kind of gray, and it'll look very distinct from the rest of the armor. I'm pretty happy with the armor, so I'm going to move on to some of his clothing. You can kind of see his pants at the back of his legs because the plates don't cover that area. And I'm going to start by base coating them in Vallejo black red. I'm also going to be base coating parts of his surcoat in this Vallejo black red, namely the fringes along the bottom and also his sleeves. I'm going to make the surcoat kind of variable color, so it's actually going to be two different colors, red and ultimately blue. But I'm going to start out by base coating the red areas. Nothing should be too tricky here. Obviously, no, or I shouldn't say obviously, but the pants, I do plan to make a different shade from the red in the surcoat, but they both need to start out with the same black red as a base coat color. As I said, the pants are going to be separate looking from the other areas of sort of red on this outfit, and I'm going to just start out by taking care of them first. I have made first a mix of the black red and some Vallejo saddle brown, so it's kind of an orangey red color, and I'm going to use that to start carefully shading those areas. It just should go really quick for you because there's not very much cloth showing here, very little need to blend or worry too much. So I'm going to put that initial first layer on, then I'm going to add a second highlight level, which is going to be just pure saddle brown, just gradually over the top, a little bit lighter, just kind of building it up. And then I'm finally going to highlight again with a mixture of the saddle brown and some buff, and then finish off with an even or really light mix of buff and saddle brown. Next, I'm going to be doing the leather areas on this figure. Now, if you want to get creative, you could have various different colored leather areas. You could pick out the scabbard and dagger in one color, the boots and the belt in another, whatever. You can get, creative here, as I said. But I'm going to keep it simple and just use one color for everything. So that includes his boots, the straps holding his armor plates on, all of his belting and all of the straps and stuff, and his scabbard on his sword and his dagger. And I'm just going to start out by base coating all of those areas with just some German camouflage black brown, and nothing too tricky here. Just make sure you're careful and don't spoil your existing paintwork. I'm then going to apply a first real quick highlight of chocolate brown. This should go real easily because it's not a lot lighter than the black brown, so it's a subtle highlight, which means you won't have to spend very much time blending or smoothing it out to get a nice result. I'm then going to make a more pronounced highlight here by mixing some khaki into my chocolate brown here, which you can see lightens the color up and makes it a rather grayish toned leather. I've shown a lot of different shades of leather in my videos before. I've shown more red leathers, all different shades, but this is going to be more of a gray or lighter type leather. So that's my first sort of mixture here, and you can see I'm sort of applying it, as always, to the edges of all the strapping and strips of leather, and then sort of blending in from there so it's lightest towards the edges and a little bit darker in the middle. And I'm applying layers and building it up too, just to further emphasize sort of the lighter edge and sort of darker middle effect. And I'm continuing now just by adding more khaki into my mix now. It's probably pretty close to pure khaki. I might even have put a little bit of buff into this color. And I'm just going to continue the process of working it onto the edges of the leather, just smaller amounts than in the last step, and carefully blending it out, or on the very thinnest strips, not even blending it out, just sort of applying it as a very thin edge highlight. And I'm finishing off the leather now by mixing even more buff in, so I have a really light color, and I'm going to use that just very sparingly along all of the edges, very softly, to show this area of extreme wear, or just where there's a lot of light hitting. All the leather areas on this figure are quite thin and narrow, which makes this process very, very easy. You don't have to worry as much about blending things. You can just kind of apply it along the top edges of all these surfaces, and you'll get a nice, you know, convincing looking result. Now, as you remember, I blocked in part of the surcoat already using black red, and now I'm going to paint the rest of it, and I decided I would make it blue, and I'm using a base coat here of dark Prussian blue. Now, obviously, these knights often wore bright colors. They had interesting heraldry on their jackets oftentimes. I'm not going to be doing that here just because I want my knight to feel a little bit more generic, and, you know, I don't want to make him into a specific person. And also the pose of this knight, and also his size. He's quite petite, or I should say he's on the more petite side. Makes it harder to really do a lot with designs or heraldry. So we're just going to be working here with basic color blocking. My first highline in the blue here is going to be just Vallejo blue, which is a beautiful, really bright, intense, sort of saturated shade. It's very cheerful. I really like how it looks, and you can see it really, it has this very nice luminous quality, especially when applied over a very dark shade, or sort of dark layers like we have going here. And though, of course, because it is such a dark base, you may find you need to layer it on a couple of times to really build up as much sort of color and brightness as you can possibly get out of the paint. Now I'm going to work on highlighting the blue. I am lightening my blue by mixing deep sky blue into it. So my first highlight just has a little bit of deep sky blue, not too much, but it's quite a bit lighter color, so it'll go quickly. That is to say, a little will go a long way. So you can see I have just put a little in, and now I'm applying it to the lightest areas and just sort of blending it out. So it's a little more deep and more shaded under his arms, and sort of where it goes underneath armor or belts or that kind of thing under his arms. Just kind of the logical places. Once I've applied this initial highlight, I'm just going to continue by lightening the color I already have with more of the deep sky blue. So my next shade is going to just be even lighter and even brighter, and I'm just going to go back over and start brightening and lightening the layers up. And you will probably find with this, as with the sort of just plain blue level, that you'll need to apply several coats of each color to get the maximum brightness out of it. But this is quite a small area you're working with here, so it shouldn't take you very long to do. You can see as I get up to these higher blue highlights, I'm going to start adding some subtle sort of wrinkle shading to the back of the surcoat, just really soft, subtle wrinkles. You don't want to paint those or really start to define them until you get up to this stage, or else they'll look too stark. I'm going to take a final highlight color then of just almost pure deep sky blue, and you can see I'm going to use that as a final emphasis where I want to show some like sort of more sharp creases, or where I really want to make there be a lot of light hitting, like along the sort of divide between the red and blue in his surcoat, really along the tops of his shoulders, that kind of thing. And you will, of course, want to be careful to blend this color out. Don't put it on too thickly or too heavily, or his surcoat's going to get just too light too quickly. Now I'm going to be doing the red parts of his surcoat, and if you've seen me paint red before, you know my technique is pretty fast and easy. I always work with Citadel reds because I think they have a really nice intensity of color, especially when applied over the Vallejo black red. So my first layer here is Citadel Mephiston red. You can see I'm just going to apply it, not everywhere, but I'm going to apply it first sort of to the areas where there's going to be the most light, and then sort of pull it out from there. So it really coats pretty much the whole area, but it's not going to be quite as intense or quite as heavy in the sort of down in the folds and creases, and it sort of just will naturally do that. It sort of flows outwards, gets thinner, and in the places away from where you applied it, and it's heavier in the areas where you where you first put your brush. Once it dries, especially over this really black red color, it will darken down. It won't seem quite so bright as when you first applied it. So you almost certainly then want to go back over and apply a second layer of it, particularly to those areas where you want a really nice, bright, strong red effect and you really want to build up color. Now I'm going to finish highlighting my red here using Citadel Evil Sun Scarlet, which is a Citadel layer color, which means the paint is quite transparent. It is not very useful on its own, but when applied over darker red colors, you can really build up your shade, make it really vibrant, really saturated, really pretty. Unlike the last shade, you'll find it sort of flows very easily, so you sort of just apply it to the areas where you want the most light, the most color, and then sort of pull it outward from there, and it will require very little blending and smoothing to get a nice result. You'll just need to go back over it a couple times and just make sure you just emphasize those areas where you want the most color intensity and just build it up. And it's really actually a lot of fun because you just get this great red effect and just see it kind of grow, and you're really not having to put in too much effort to achieve that look. Now pretty much all the areas that I have not yet painted on this figure that I've left till the last, I'm going to want to make a sort of a gold shiny color. So that includes things like his spurs, sort of one of his belts that he's wearing, all the hardware on his scabbard, his dagger handle, the handle of his sword, some of the trim and detail work on his helmet, all that. I mean, I made some obvious conscientious choices about what areas I would make gold. You could make some of the areas that I made gold silver. It's really up to you. But in any case, I've taken a base coat here of German camouflage black brown and mixed some Vallejo air gold in here. Obviously, you want more of the brown. You want a pretty dark color as the base for this stage because it'll look better when you build the lighter colors over top of it. Once you've applied that to all the places where you want gold, I'm then going to just take pure Vallejo air gold and start going back over all those places. Obviously, you want to make sure you leave all the cracks and dividing lines in the gold in that deeper brown color so that there's, clear, distinct elements, but otherwise you just want to build the gold up on all of the other pieces. And you might want to put a couple of layers on just to get sort of the maximum shininess. Vallejo gold is actually quite a deep bronzy color, so I often find that if you want a really blingy look, it's probably going to need a little more to achieve that. And the best trick, in fact, I found for doing that, for getting a shinier gold when your initial gold is not a very bright one, is to take the Vallejo air gold and then mix some Vallejo air, either steel or silver, into it, and about a 50-50 mix. And you're going to get a color that's kind of this kind of browny gray metallic color, and it's like, that's kind of weird. It doesn't look gold at all, but then if you keep your paint thin and then you lightly, and I say lightly, don't put it too intensive, but lightly, very carefully sort of layer it over your gold, it's going to sort of make that gold then look much shinier and much brighter, especially if you don't overdo it. If you put too much on, you just cover the whole area with that color, you're going to lose the gold. So the trick here is it really has to be very subtly applied, very thinly, just in choice areas where you really want it to look like a lot of light is catching the gold. And then if you do this carefully, then you can really just, you can get that blingy effect. You might even want to put one final area, or a highlight I should say, of just pure silver on there, but then if you do that, keep it really, really sparse, again, because you want to make sure that the areas are clearly gold and not silver or steel looking on your model. Okay, so here's our kind of 100 Years' War Agincourt era foot knight type model. He looks really very good. I'm very happy how he came out. I'm particularly pleased with how quickly he went. As I mentioned in my introduction, medieval armies I think are actually really nice if you want to put together a really nice looking force really quickly. I don't know what it is, but you can really do these models fast. Maybe because there's not very much skin to paint, or there's just a lot, sort of one color going on, a lot of metal, I should say. And I know probably some people say, painting metal is such a pain, but if you have these paints, and that's what really makes a difference, these Vallejo Air metal paints, it's really quite straightforward, and you know, you can do a figure like this. This figure took me maybe 45 minutes, even given that I was filming all the time, which does slow things down, and for me that's really quite quick in terms of painting a figure to this standard. And I mean, obviously, if you put more work into heraldry or the surcoat, that can make things take longer. But on the other hand, if you're going to make a big force, you're not going to want to put all of your guys in really fancy, you know, painted clothing in that sense. And again, this technique I did on metal, it's a little bit different from in my earlier video. In some ways, I think it's actually simpler. You're avoiding like all the fine lining, which I did, and the fine lining does look nice, but I think this technique looks very good too. It relies a lot on the fact that there's this black base coat, which helps, you know, define all the separate pieces very well, and that saves you a lot of time, I think, in the long run when you're you know, when you're painting a guy like this. So again, I hope you found this video useful, interesting. Let me know what you thought in the comments. Share it with your friends. You know, like the video, of course. All of that good stuff. And yes, definitely subscribe to the channel as well. Sorry, I almost forgot. So that you can keep up with my you know, latest updates if you have not done that already. Right. So I think that is all for this episode, and I will see you next time.